I can't. Just stood there, just waiting for Gideon to tell him what they were going to buy. And Gideon, who had that big grin on his face again, he said, well, actually, I'm not going to go. Really weird to the Reverend. He did not feel like this was a normal request, nor did he want to go in the store. He wanted to leave. But for some reason, he just said, okay. And he turned and shuffled in the store, found a new hatchet, paid for it with his own money, walked outside, handed it over to Gideon. And then at this point, the Reverend just wanted to get on his horse and get away from Gideon. But the second the Reverend got back on his horse to do that, Gideon hopped on his soon, and I'm thinking about maybe getting married.
It's over for you. This is a creepy story that happened at a church, apparently.
And we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to clean the Like Button's house. But instead of cleaning it, just go ahead and bring a wrecking crew to their property and level it. Also, okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of January 5th, 1909, a 56-year-old reverend named John Carmichael kissed his wife and kids goodbye and then stepped out of his cottage into the cold. Reverend Carmichael lived going to host this big religious revival. Basically, he was going to hold this big sermon and try to get new people to join his church. And so as the Reverend galloped his way down the road, he saw all these kids outside having snowball fights and making snowmen, and it was just really nice. But also, and parents did. And so as the Reverend is really just trying nice, but after about 30 minutes, he had reached a point in the journey where all the houses were kind of behind him, and he had this kind of nice, quiet stretch, this stretch of the road. It was just very peaceful, and gave him, as the Reverend was having this sort of peaceful time trotting his way down the snowy road, he heard the sound of hooves fast approaching, and the guy's hair was slicked back and greasy, and he had this big, weird grin on his face, and he was waving wildly at the Reverend, obviously trying to flag him down. The Reverend lived, and he was known for being kind of erratic and had a horrible drinking problem. And frankly, you know, the Reverend just wanted to be left alone. Here he was in Drum. People knew who he was. He couldn't just be a jerk to people. He had to be kind. And so he smiled at Gideon and waved to him to be polite, but was to the point where it was becoming weird that he just kept seeing Gideon. And every time he interacted with Gideon, it was just awful, because Gideon was just totally an unpleasant person. But here he was. His first question was, hey, Reverend, can I ride with you? And the Reverend, again, is like, my goodness, I don't want to do this right now. But he was like, of course we can ride together. And pretty much immediately, the Reverend regretted this decision, because Gideon would just not shut up. He just talked the entire time they were supposed to be in this peaceful part of the Reverend's journey. The Reverend was going, what he was doing there, and you know, how many churches did the Reverend own, and just all these personal questions, and sort of against his better judgment, the churches that he owned in a town called Rattle Run. And as the Reverend was again kind of giving up this information that he kind of wished he wasn't, he noticed Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin and began flipping the coin into the air and catching it and flipping it and catching it over and over and over again, never affecting his riding. I mean, it was like Gideon wasn't even aware he was flicking this coin. And the Reverend, you know, he's kind of watching Gideon just with Gideon's hand-eye coordination. The Reverend began to notice that he really liked what Gideon was doing with this coin. It was kind of soothing in a way. Not so much the actual coin flipping in the air, but the sound it was making, the sound of it spinning in the air and slapping into his palm over and over again, it just kind of put the Reverend at ease, and he didn't know why. And so after a while, the Reverend just kind of stopped answering Gideon's questions and just kind of stared at the coin and listened to that sound. And he just felt himself drift into this weird, relaxed state, almost like he felt. Gideon catches his coin, puts it back in his pocket, and the two men, they come to a stop at this general store, even though the Reverend did not want to go to this general store. He just kind of followed Gideon up to the hitching post. They both got off their horses. They tied their horses to the post. Here, we need to get something. And the Reverend found himself saying, okay, what are we going to get? Mr. Ballin. And the Reverend's thinking, what am I saying? I don't want to do this. I don't want to stop here. I got to go. But he just stood there, just waiting for Gideon to tell him what they were going to buy. And Gideon, who had that big grin on his face again, he said, well, actually, I'm not going to go into the store. You are. You're going to go in there, you're going to buy me a new hatchet, and you're going to bring it out here and give it to me. And now everything about this was totally weird to the Reverend. He did not feel like this was a normal request, nor did he want to go in the store. He wanted to leave. Handed it over to Gideon, and then at this point, the Reverend just wanted to get on his horse and get away from Gideon. But the second the Reverend got back on his horse to do that, Gideon hopped on his horse and said, hold on a minute, Reverend, we're not done yet. now we're going to go to your church in Rattle Run. He wants to go to Columbus. He doesn't want to be around Gideon at all, but for some reason he just said, okay, yeah, we'll go to my church in Rattle Run. And so at this point, Gideon pulled out his coin and started flipping it again and again. And the two men rode side by side in the direction of Rattle Run. And the whole time, the Reverend's thinking, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And also, in addition to just brain fog and confusion, the Reverend also realized that Gideon was clearly lying to him because he knew Gideon was married. So what's he talking about needing to scope out his church? But he was really starting to feel scared. But again, he just couldn't stop agreeing to the things Gideon wanted to do. And so the two men galloped their way to Rattle Run. The whole time Gideon's flipping that coin and staring at the Reverend, and the Reverend's just totally transfixed on the coin. And then they get to the church. Gideon puts the coin in his pocket. The two men hitch their horses to the post outside. They go up to the front door. The Reverend Gideon was still standing right in front of the doorway. Gideon suddenly told the Reverend to stop where he was. And so the Reverend stopped in the middle of the church, and he's just looking at Gideon, who's flipping that coin up and down, just says, no, I don't need to look around. There is no wedding. Hey, Reverend, go ahead and lift up your left arm. And at this point, the Reverend is terrified, he's confused, and his left arm just suddenly raised up into the air. He had no control over it. And then a second later, Gideon says, hey, go. At this point, the Reverend's just standing there with his arms out to the side, and it was at this point going on here. But before the Reverend could say or do anything about how totally weird the situation was, Gideon, who was flipping that coin and had a big glaring at the Reverend, and then he dropped the coin to the ground and began moving towards the Reverend. The following day, around noon, the caretaker for Reverend made sure, nothing was out of the ordinary. And as this caretaker galloped up to this small white steepled church, he noticed right away there was a column of smoke coming up out of the chimney. Clearly, there was a fire lit inside of the church, and the caretaker's thinking, that doesn't make any sense. The Reverend is not supposed to be here, so who could possibly be in the church right now? And then after the caretaker got up to the front door, he was about to put his key in the lock when he discovered the door was already unlocked. And so instinctively, he put his hand on his pistol on his hip, and then he grabbed the handle and he flung the door open. And when he looked inside the church, he just froze. Because the entire interior of the church was drenched in blood. There was blood on the pews, the walls, on the altar, and then also amongst all this blood, the caretaker also noticed there were little pieces of ripped up fabric all over the place, and he saw one of them had a unique button sewn into it, a button he recognized as belonging on Reverend Carmichael's suit. And so the caretaker is horrified, he's looking around, he doesn't see anybody, but he sees there's a drag trail right down the center aisle all the way up to the altar, and it curves around to the right out of view. Now, the caretaker wanted to turn and run away, but he was worried that maybe Reverend Carmichael was in here somewhere and was maybe still alive and he could help him. And so the caretaker felt like it was his responsibility to investigate. And so he drew his pistol and he began walking down this bloody aisle, kind of looking around for any sign of blood, and he kept on walking to where the blood trail turned around the pew, and it led right up to that stove that was obviously still smoldering, and the door to the stove was shut, so the caretaker couldn't see what was inside of it. And so the caretaker just walked up to the stove, and after looking around one more time to make sure nobody else was in here, he opened up the stove, and inside the stove was a human skull. Within 24 hours, there was this huge police investigation that was launched to try to figure out who killed him. And very quickly, the police in Rattle Run spoke side of his church. Well, on that same day, a man named Gideon Browning had this really big blow-up public fight in town, same town as Reverend Carmichael, with his brother-in-law. And this fight was so explosive, lots of people saw it and heard it, and people said after this big man, they would say that they saw Reverend Carmichael traveling down this road because he talked to all the kids and their parents in the same direction as Reverend Carmichael. And after that, nobody had seen Gideon since. And so very quickly, Gideon became the #1 suspect in this murder. And basically the thought was, Gideon was so angry from this fight with his brother-in-law that he must have just taken out his anger on the Reverend. Basically, the Reverend was in the wrong place at the wrong time and got killed. Now, the police knew this was a flimsy theory at best, but Gideon had to. And so within 24 hours of the murder, there was this huge multi-statewide manhunt for Gideon. 3 days later, and 500 miles away from the town of Rattle Run, in a city in Illinois, a man opened the door to a boarding house and stepped stifle a gasp because this man looked absolutely horrible. He was wearing this really dark stained brown shirt with a long overcoat over it, and he was shivering and skinny and pale and just looked like he was older, and he wanted to rent a room. Now, Miranda, for a second, thought about refusing this guy's service, just because, honestly, he kind of frightened her. But then it goes to a room on the second floor. She opened it up, John stepped inside, and Miranda, as a courtesy, said, "Hey, do you want me to make you some food?" And John, Miranda would come up to his room and leave food outside of his door at every mealtime. It was something she did for her guests. But John never came out to get the food. And for a little while, Miranda was actually kind of concerned about this guy, considering how terrible he looked, and now he's fasting. That didn't seem healthy. But at murder, and 3 days after John Elder had checked into this boarding house, Miranda was walking across the back lawn of this boarding house when she heard what sounded like somebody moaning in pain coming from the outhouse. Now, normally, Miranda would never even think of going to the
Just
outhouse
bad shit.
and seeing
Don't worry
if
about
somebody
it.
was okay in there. But the sound this person was making the only sound she heard coming out was more moaning and whimpering. And so, acting on a gut instinct, Miranda grabbed the door and flung it open, and what she saw made her scream. It was John Elder, and he was sitting on the toilet looking up at her with wide, panicked eyes, and his throat had been slashed from ear to ear. She could basically see deep into his neck. This was a fatal wound, and he was bleeding everywhere. And so Miranda stumbled backwards, turned around, and ran to go find police.
Oh,
By the
shit.
time the police arrived at the boarding house and went to the outhouse, John Elder was already dead from this horrible wound. And at first, the police did not connect the death of John Elder to what had happened in Rattle Run 500 miles away. They were totally done. And as soon as the police read it, they knew they had something huge on their hands, because John Elder was not who he said he was. To understand who John Elder was, and to even begin to understand what happened in Rattle Run, we need to go back to January 6th. During that journey, Reverend Carmichael did come in contact with Gideon Browning. Gideon Browning came up alongside him, they rode together, they went to that general store, and Reverend Carmichael did buy that hatchet for Gideon, and they did go to the Rattle Run Church. But the reason they did all these strange activities together is not because Gideon had hypnotized Reverend Carmichael. The actual reason for why they did these things together is even more bizarre. In the weeks leading up to that fateful day, January 6th, Reverend Carmichael was running into Gideon Browning all the time, all over town. It was like everywhere the Reverend went, there was Gideon. And then on January 6th, when the Reverend is making his way down the road, and he turns and sees Gideon Browning coming up alongside him, he's like, oh my goodness, it's happening again. But the way the Reverend handled this was not to say, wow, what a strange coincidence. I keep running into this guy everywhere I go. Instead, the Reverend believed that Gideon must have some sort of special power, that he's able to know where I am at all times, and he's using that power to try to intimidate me by spying on me. And so on January 6th, when Gideon came galloping up alongside of the Reverend's already completely paranoid and on edge about Gideon, fearing this guy has magical powers, basically. And then when Gideon pulled out that coin and began flipping it into the air, which apparently was just something he did, the Reverend took that as, oh my goodness, in addition to having magical powers to always know where I am, Gideon also has the power of hypnosis. And that coin that I can't take my eyes off, that sounds so incredible, and it's soothing me, well, that is hypnotizing me. Gideon is now controlling me and my thoughts and my body. And so at this point, the Reverend actually believed he was hypnotized, and so he just kind of began going along with anything Gideon wanted. And so it's assumed that Gideon did want to stop at the general store and just kind of said, hey, do you want to stop at the general store? And the Reverend's like, yes, I'll stop at the general store. And then maybe Gideon asked the Reverend, hey, do you mind buying me a new hatchet? And the Reverend's like, yes, I'll buy you a new hatchet. And he goes in, gets the hatchet, comes back out. And then apparently, Gideon said, hey, I want to go check out your church in Rattle Run. And the Reverend was like, yeah, okay, let's go check it out. And then Cross, even though, Gideon had not made him do that. This is the Reverend, caught up in his own delusion. As he's standing there like this, Gideon, who's
Fucking
flipping the
bastards,
coin,
man.
fumbles it, and it falls to the ground. And the Reverend, who believes that coin has myself. And so the Reverend ran and grabbed the Reverend had those clothes. He hacked Gideon to pieces and then burned his body in that stove. And then after this horrific murder, the Reverend took his own suit and basically the one
Holy
who was
shit.
killed, and that was his skull inside
Nothing,
the
I'm
stove. And then he put on all of Gideon Browning's clothes, the brown dirty shirt and the long coat, and then was hiding out inside of the boarding house. The police at Rattle Run very quickly figured out that the body inside of the church, the skull inside of the stove, and the remains that were in there did not belong to Reverend Carmichael. They belonged to Gideon Browning. And so immediately it went from, Gideon Browning, aka John Elder, had gone into that outhouse and slit his own throat. However, when the police searched John Elder's body, so Reverend Carmichael's body, they would find that blood-stained letter addressed to the sheriff in Rattle Run, and basically it was all these special powers, and he basically was acting in self-defense, but nonetheless, it was still a confession to murder. Now, of course, there's lots of details in the story that we can't be totally sure of.
Never trust a bastard. They're either going to touch your kids or kill you.
Discussions were like between Reverend Carmichael and Gideon Browning when they met on that road and then eventually made their way to the church and the murder happened. But this story happened at a time when nobody took mental health seriously, and so it's very unlikely that even if authorities had known about that this crime could have been prevented.
Crazy.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that...
Well, let's see what else. What else? Jess is gonna clean the dog's ears.
It's gonna be a full pool party, and there's gonna be a lot of whining and moaning.
Blue dental's been serving that Thrax backpack full of killer. Rolling that dope smoke blowing out the window. Pull up on a bitch late night, I just met her. She want my kids, I still ain't hit her. I still ain't rich, I'm trying to get rich, I'm trying to get paid. Boy sharp as a blade, outcast, renegade. Got plenty of hate, people switch up and they flake. They two-faced and they fake, I can't even fuck with you. In that truck with you, when the bullets was flying, shit, I even ducked with you. Gotta cook it off them drugs and feel so sedated. I've been riding around that big body. From the sticks just to hick, I'm a nobody. Still I get in the booth, drop a hit like I'm somebody. Someday it's some ice in the chain. They stopping my hustle, got too many plays. Man, you ain't stopping my drive, I'm winning this game. That boy was my brother till he went and changed. Now we on the outside, just a young go-getter. White boy with the pack, I was man in the middle. Tucking that strap, and these old blue dentals. Been serving that Thrax backpack full of killer. Rolling that dope smoke blowing out the window. Pull up on a bitch late night, I just met her. She want my kids, I still ain't hit her. I still ain't rich, I'm trying to get rich, I'm trying to get up. I'm just trying to get mine and maybe a little on the side. I've been counting bucks. Shit, I ain't never satisfied, it ain't never enough. Put mud in my cup, just to help with these demons. It feel like they ain't never leaving. That shit, it ain't work. It's like somebody cursed me. I feel like I'm doing this shit for no reason. I can't even front, man. Did this shit by myself with no stunt, man. Now I'm busting their heads like a coke can. Get the low from my folks, that's them old heads. What you know about it? No, you don't know, man. I ain't trusting a soul, cause just like the paper, I know they'll fold. Put trust in their hands, it'll slip through the holes. It could be one of your mans, it could be one of I don't get two shits what they talking about. They gon' hate anyway, man, they talk a lot. You can't get in my lane or my parking spot. 392 way too fast, it'll pill out the parking lot. Trapping and rapping straight out my garage. And we had them drugs, guns, and bras. Make the raw move and get plugged like a Targe. Just like the one on this beat behind all these bars, man. Get her. White boy with the pack, I was man in the middle. Tucking that strap, and these old blue dentals. Been serving that Thrax backpack full of killer. Rolling that dope smoke blowing out the window. Pull up on a bitch late night, I just met her. She want my kids, I still ain't hit her. I still ain't rich, I'm trying to get rich. I'm trying to young go get her. White boy with the pack, I was man in the middle. Tucking that strap, and these old blue dentals. Been serving that Thrax backpack full of killer. Rolling that dope smoke blowing out the window. Pull up on a bitch late night, I just met her. She want my kids, I still.
Us earlier, Dad and I were checking back.
I just get with an attitude. Yeah, you got me throwing blue strips.
I was enjoying it because I've been this late in the day. And I thought, what? Think about all the people that I killed. Right? And then he's figuring out.
But I don't. All I wanted was you, but fuck it, shit. I guess that we through. You got a new man, well I got a new boo, new bitch, new tits. I blue strips
Pretty
too,
good
like
run,
Lord.
bro.
The love that we had couldn't last for forever. Now I'm in the club off the pills and the liquor, throwing
Cheers, diamonds.
new bitch, new tricks. She don't give me no lip. I love what we had, but we sucked that shit. Now I'm wiping my tears with these new blue strips.
It's major. It's major.
Lay back, Chevy flow, no for riches, I love to go. How to go, how to go. Lay back, Chevy flow, no 24. Crack, I'm like, fuck it, I'll buy some more. I'm addicted to riches, I love to go. How to go. I'm out of bed, I just rolled a check. I just gave her some money, so mama ain't got stress. But shit, it ain't about the dough. It's all about the gold. All of the problems I done had, I don't have them no more. But I swear shit's on the chain. Since I jumped in the game, since I jumped in the booth and picked up the money, go tell your brothers and sisters, go tell the fam. I'm the man, I'm the man. Tell your mommy and daddy I'm going ham. I'm the man, I'm the man. Lay back, Chevy flow, no 24s. Rims cracked, I'm like, go, how to go. Lay back, Chevy flow, no 24s. Rims cracked, I'm like, fuck it, I'll buy some more. I'm addicted to riches. Shit, all of the things I done did, all of the moves I done made, putting my people position. I had to pull a few strings, had to make me a way. Now I built me a business and they can't take that.
I had to go to a local place and get this. It works though.
I'm the man. Tell your mommy and daddy I'm going ham. I'm the man. I'm the man. Lay back, Chevy flow, no 24s. Rims cracked, I'm like, fuck it, I'll buy some more. I'm addicted to riches, I love cracked, I'm like, fuck it, I'll buy some more. I'm addicted to riches, I love to go. How to go, how to go.
Weak knees in a CVS, door locked in the bathroom. What's it gonna be waiting on that test? Never thought that they'd be putting those life plans on the shelf. A couple American babies raising one up theirself. One beer turns into a lit cigarette, burning into a 2-beer buzz. 3 beers turns into 5, it was just a Bud Light, but ain't it funny what one beer can turn into? On-stick figure family, stuck right there front center on the fridge. Flashback to 2 pink lines, whole bunch of praying and doubt. Felt like the end of the world now, the world don't spin without it. Turns into a lit cigarette, burning into a 2-beer buzz. 3 beers turns into 5 and 6, then I love drunk kids in the back of that truck. Just like that, everything.
Then he came with an ass.
okay. I ain't even gonna flex this Sunday. I ain't even up next, but one day you gon' put this tape in, hit the replay, gon' vibe and you ride, chill to the music, feeling what I'm putting inside, dealing with your vulnerable side. This go hard and I ain't even try. Close your eyes, just vibe with me. Do or die for life, really. When I'm riding, he drive with me. Great spirit is my Siri. Navigate through the ways of the land. Demonstrate when the niggas understand. Give me grace when I don't understand which way is the best. No, God's got a plan. Throughout my life, my hands stay dirty. Down the ride when it's necessary. Walk a line, I got no worries. Take my time, I'm in no hurry. Brothers die, so my eyes blurry. Another ride to the cemetery. Live your life, you know death coming. But a vape and we gone, homie. You don't really want no problem. You don't really want no problem. You don't really want no problem. You don't really want, you don't really want no problem.
You don't really want no smoke, let them say what they say, let them talk, let them talk. I remember back when I was down bad broke, they would still talk shit, they would still crack jokes, they was laughing at the kid, now they all take notes, trying to ride my way, but I built this boat, they gon' speak on my name like my dick and they throat, bitch, my foot on they neck till they motherfucking choke, man, I started from the ground up, back into the pounds up, snakes in the grass, I just spray the weeds around up, they don't make me act up, they be trying to act tough, no plan B, bitch, I didn't have a backup, music man, yeah, you don't really want no problem, you don't wanna end up in a coffin, lay this on the internet top.
You don't really want no problem. You don't really want no problem. You don't really want no problem. You don't really want, you don't really want no problem.
We live in a society where nobody's doing things quietly in the land of broken promises. And they be speaking about it from in the place where they hide. And nobody can find them because they anonymous. The cowardly people that's taking up space. Say they divine, but look like they fell from grace. Speaking their mind, but who said it was your place? Say it online, but wouldn't say it to my face. It's more like a fantasy or like a fallacy to challenge me about me. Ask the bodies that competed with me. Cause what you hear is too true. Fear it, do you? Premier and guru when you step in the arena with me. Body bags, toe tags, so sad that we had to kill another adversary. Preliminaries at the cemetery, a bit of every enemy. I don't know whose body I'm finna bury. Lyrically, I don't know whose cipher I'm finna spit in. Physically, I don't know whose body I'm about to rock. Cause all I know is when it come down to doing this is blasphemy. If you asking me if I'm gon' stop, I'm monster within the method of my madness. When it come to music and make you check out my melody. Cause sometimes I use music as therapy, but sometimes I use music as weaponry. Twister, Jam Wang.
You don't really want no problem. You don't really want no problem. You don't really want no problem. You don't really want, you don't really want no problem.
It's major. It's major.
501. Come on, man. Box shape. These are 33s. 6-inch lift with the console seat. Big mud ties, need my ball joints greased. I'm feeling every bump, every stump in the street. You can hear me coming down the block before I turn. Too damn high, catch a pop, head blown. Cheap from reefer, get it cheaper by the bowl. Blowing smoke, rolling down the window. Rain, sleet, or snow, ain't no road I can't go. Bitch, I been riding for a minute. Sonic cup sipping, pistol in the truck, boy, don't let me catch you slipping. Hair finger trigger, sliding boy, I slipper like a snake in the creek. I be high until I get you. I ain't got no co-pilot, cause I know how to fly you. Whip sitting back like I caught a flat tire. Boy, I been wildin', I can't even hide it. My square box Chevy was my favorite, can't deny it. Box Chevy, these are 33s. 6-inch lift with the console seat. Big mud ties, need my ball joints greased. I'm feeling every bump, every stump in the street. You can hear me coming down the block before I turn. Too damn high, catch a flop from all the birds. If I break down, I fix it, I ain't worried. Country boy state of mind, boy, my ride so dirty. Boy, my ride so dirty.
Four low on, hit the gas, roll the dope, blow smoke on. Two doors on, four low on.
Hey, boy, I started off thugging, country boy hustling. Up in my bag, got played by the dozen. Touching my cash, then you better get a ducking. Boy, I don't play by my motherfucking money. Sticks with the drums, weed and the drugs. Boy, I got everything you need plus some. Bitches on me tryna have my son. I don't wanna fuck, then she asked, how come, man? I don't need to talk to them hoes. Face down, ass up, then I'm blocking the hoe. Boy, you the type to put paint on the toes. Cash in the pocket, coke in the nose. Leaving out the mind with a wrist full of gold. Steak in the stomach, a brand new coat. After y'all done, she pull up to my home and give me what I want. Man, these bitches so cold, that's why I'm a soldier. Hustle from sun up to sundown. I ain't gon' play around, that's why I'm a soldier. Stand up guy, won't lay down. No, I won't put the K down, that's why I'm a soldier. I done got built up and broke down, so I'm on my own now, that's why I'm a soldier. I'm not a snake, I'm a cobra. Fuck me over, then I'm fucking you over.
You fuck me over, you done. I fucked on this bitch like a handful of times. I seen his ass at the motherfucking pump. Yeah, he paid for that gas with a handful of dimes. Cursed on that boy, then he motherfucking cried. I don't have shit to do, but I'm late every time. I hop on the track and talk shit every line. She say when we fucking, she know that every time. Bitch, I'm a soldier, got hits in the photo. I know that ain't gas, I can tell by the odor. That boy a self steady trying to control her, but she want a pimp to come scoop in the roller. This gon' be crazy, she thinking I owe her. You know I'm still thugging, got Glocks in the stroller. He green as hell like a motherfucking clover. I pull up, this bitch come with me, then it's
That's why
over.
I'm a soldier. Hustle from sun up to sundown. I ain't gon' play around. That's why I'm a soldier. Stand up guy, won't lay down. No, I won't put the K down. That's why I'm a soldier. I done got built up and broke down, so I'm on my own now. That's why I'm a soldier. I'm not a snake, I'm a cobra. Fuck me over, then I'm fucking you over. Boy, not. I got the guap. Stick in the whip and a stick in the bot.
I'll show your ass on some motherfucking crocs. Yeah, I'm serving these things up and down the whole block.
I never was shot, but I had some ops. Put up to the spot, then they let out some pots.
Hey, you got the time on the motherfucking Glock 203 time of death, he no longer my op.
I'm on some raw shit, I'm cautious. I don't fuck with flogging.
All around my table, you see nothing but some bosses.
Me, bitch, I'm a hustler. I don't fuck with busters.
Yeah, you know I'm strapped, I keep that bitch like General Cuss.
That's why I'm a soldier. Hustle from sun up to sundown. I ain't gon' play around. That's why I'm a soldier. Stand up guy, won't lay down. No, I won't put the K down. That's why I'm a soldier. I done got built up and broke down, so I'm on my own now. That's why I'm a soldier. I'm not a snake, I'm a cobra. Fuck me over, then I'm fucking you over.
Yeah.
Now, but we're the stairs, what I was doing. I'm gonna leave off so we can get home and I can do it.
See, man, my mama told me this, and boy, mama told me that. And if you ever get some money, just be sure to make it last. Boy, mama told me slow up, I believe it too fast. I was sitting lips and black ski mask. Boy, believe me, mama tried, I was just too wide. I was chiefing on the reef for 15, blowing loud. I'm still turned up and I won't never turn down. Mama said I need to turn my life around.